Hello and welcome. My name is Tim, and today I want to talk to you about Matthew 16, 18, and 19, answering the question, what is the church? Now, the reason I want to look at these verses is that Matthew 16, 18, and 19 are the first time in both the New Testament corpus and chronologically that the church is mentioned. And as Christ's introduction to what the church is, as the first time the church is mentioned, these verses are going to be really significant for understanding the mission of the church, the definition of the church, and what it means to be a part of the church. So we'll dive right in by reading these verses along with the full context, which will start in verse 13. This is in the ESV. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven." And here's our verses. "And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Now, there's a lot that we can unpack in these verses. We have the renaming of Simon to Peter in this verse. We have the statement, "On this rock I'll build my church," and we could talk about who that's referring to, and is that Peter or something else? We could talk about the keys to the kingdom of heaven and the gates of hell. There's a lot to talk about here. So this is going to be a two-part video, and in this first part I just want to focus in on the word church itself and what this word teaches us about the church. So why did Jesus use this word to refer to his covenant community, and what does this word actually mean? So we're going to focus on those things in this first video, and in a follow-up video we'll talk about the rest of the issues. So now this word church, we're not talking about the English word church, we're talking about the Greek word that is translated church. And if you know Spanish, you'll be at a little bit of advantage here. Our Greek word is ekklesia. Now, sounds a little bit like the Spanish iglesia, and that's because Spanish derived their word for church directly from this Greek word, whereas the English word church is derived from a different Greek word, kuriakos, which means belonging to the Lord. So there's a little bit of separation there. But the word in Greek is ekklesia. And we're going to look at this word in two different ways. First, we want to look at the etymology of this word and what we can garner from that. And then I want to look at how this word is used generally in the New Testament and learn about what this word means for us based on how it's used. So first off with etymology, I'll explain this chart soon. We'll come back to that. I want to look first down here at the root. This word is a derivative of a Greek verb kaleo, which means to call, name, or summon. Kaleo is the verb there. And so it's a combination of this verb kaleo with the preposition ek, which means out. So if we take these parts literally, we've got the word ekklesia means a called out group of people. It's a group of people that have been called out for a particular purpose or to accomplish something. They've been called out of something to be something else. And we could conclude just based on this information that because ekklesia literally means a called out group of people, the church should be called out of the world to be God's people and to do God's mission. Now, that's a true statement. The church is indeed called out of the world to be God's particular people, and we'll look at some verses that show us that. However, we're skipping a couple steps if we conclude that just based on the etymology. The reason for that is because frequently we use words in ways that's not consistent with their etymology or their literal sense. We have a lot of this in English with compound words, for instance. With handshake, that word works pretty well. You meet somebody, you shake their hand, and it's a handshake. However, with other compound words in English, you've got strawberry, bulldoze, kidnap, butterfly. None of these words make any sense if you try to take their two parts literally. So it's not always the case that we can just take a word, look at its literal parts, and say the word means that. Rather, you have to look at how a word is used by the people who spoke that language. You have to look at how that word is used in the original context, and we need to do that with ekklesia as well. So that's what we're going to do rather than just look at just the literal sense of the word. So let me explain this chart up here, and we'll look at the usage. This is a chart of how the word ekklesia is translated in specifically in the NASB up here. If we changed it to a different translation, we'd get some different results. But the NASB is pretty good because it gives us several different options here. As you can see, it's almost always translated as church or churches. If we click on that here, we've got 108 out of 114 usages is translated church or churches. And our first passage is Matthew 16, 18, and 19, right there. However, the word ekklesia, before Jesus kind of co-opted it to refer to his New Testament community, it just referred to a group of people or an assembly. And we can see that here in the second part. That's why we have some different translations. In Acts 19:32, actually three times in Acts chapter 19, we see the word ekklesia being used, but not referring to the church at all. It's just referring to a group of people. And also, it's not referring to a group of people that have been called out for a particular purpose. In fact, we see it's just the opposite. Acts 19:32 says, "So then they were shouting one thing and some another, for the assembly was in confusion, and the majority did not know for what reason they'd come together." And if we looked at other extra-biblical sources of the word ekklesia being used, church wouldn't appear at all. You would pretty much just see assembly or congregation being used as the gloss there. So as it's actually used in Koine Greek, ekklesia doesn't actually mean always a called out group of people. So it's a little bit of a jump to say that based on this word's etymology, it means we should be called out. However, there's another aspect of the usage that I want to draw your attention to, which is really fascinating. And that's how this word is used in the Septuagint. Now, the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. It's the Old Testament translated into Greek, and this translation was widely used in Jesus's day. It was a very, very popular translation. And in fact, when Jesus quotes the Old Testament, he actually usually quotes the Septuagint translation of the Old Testament rather than the Hebrew of the Old Testament, which is really interesting. That's how widely used the Septuagint was. And so in the Septuagint, the word ekklesia is very strongly associated and frequently used to refer to the congregation of Israel. And we can see that here if I open up this other chart, which shows the Septuagint translation of this word. You can see here, we'll see how many times. 57 out of 75 times that ekklesia is used in the Septuagint, it's translating this word kahal, meaning the assembly, usually the assembly of Israel. So again, just to summarize, the word ekklesia is really strongly associated with the nation of Israel. And in fact, we'll see that association played out even in the New Testament. If you look at the King James Bible in particular, this is really interesting. In Acts chapter 7, verse 38. This is part of Stephen's speech in front of the Pharisees just before he's stoned. Stephen is talking about specifically Moses in verse 37. And then verse 38, he says, "This is he that was in the church in the wilderness." Now, obviously, he's not speaking about the New Testament church. He's talking about the congregation of Israel, the people who were called out of Egypt and at Mount Sinai made God's covenant people. Now, the King James authors decided to translate this church, but you will see in the ESV, you can see that they translate it not as church, but as congregation here in verse 38. This is the one who was in the congregation in the wilderness. Same in NASB. They translate it, this is the one who is in the congregation in the wilderness. But we see here Stephen using the word ekklesia to refer not to the church or not to just a random assembly of people, but specifically to the nation of Israel. And so when Jesus takes this word and uses it with his disciples, saying, "On this rock I will build my ekklesia," their minds aren't just thinking a group of people. Their minds are going to go back to that Mosaic covenant community, the community that they're a part of, the nation of Israel, as God's peculiar people that have been called out. And just like the nation of Israel was called out of Egypt to be God's special people, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, so the church is called out of the world to be God's special people and accomplish God's mission in the world. And in fact, we see this explicitly taught in several passages of Scripture. We're not just getting this from the word ekklesia itself. This is something that's throughout Scripture. A great passage we can look at for that is Romans 12:2. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Another example is James 1:27. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. So, again, being a part of God's ekklesia, his called out group of people, part of that is being a called out people, being separated from the world. If God's called you to come out from the world, it's necessary then for you to separate yourself from the world. You know, when God called Israel out of Egypt, he gave them the Mosaic covenant, and a lot of these laws in the Mosaic covenant seem to exist purely to make them separate or to teach them to be separate. We see that a lot in the dietary restrictions. You know, some of these we could point to and say for health reasons, like, oh, you don't eat pork, and that makes sense because there's parasites frequently in pork, and it might be hard to avoid those. But there's other laws that don't necessarily make sense, you know, with that, like boiling a kid in its mother's milk. Why does that exist? Well, it seems simply to exist to make them different from the nations around them who are maybe doing these things as part of cultic, idolatrous practices. But there's other laws, too, that seem purely to exist to make them different. Laws like you're not allowed to plow your field with an ox and a donkey yoked to the same plow. Or laws like you're not allowed to wear clothes made of two different fabrics. These laws seem to exist simply to pound into their minds the fact that they are different and they should not mix with people who are not them. Because they've been called to be God's holy people, they have to make themselves separate from the rest of the world. And in the same way, you as a Christian are called to be different from the people around you. You know, this means that if you call yourself a believer, you've got to take steps to separate yourself from the world. Now, there's a balance here because you could go off the deep end and, you know, be so out of touch with your culture and with the people around you that it's impossible for you to make a difference in the world. It's impossible for you to bring people to Christ, like the Amish or like monks in a monastery who never come out and never interact with anyone. We don't want to go off that end. But the other extreme is being so like the unbelievers around you that there's no reason for them to change. They don't see any reason that they need to do anything different because you're just like them. That's a problem. Christians need to be different from the unbelievers around them. And in fact, what I'm going to argue here is that, your life should be immediately identifiable without even having to tell people that you're a Christian. People should be able to tell that you're different without you having to explain it to them explicitly. They should be able to tell by your demeanor. Are you, when someone meets you, would they describe you as being polite, patient, or would they describe you as being cold, argumentative, or snappish? People shouldn't just be able to tell by your demeanor, they should be able to tell by your appearance. Is your style of dress and hair well kept, sharp, and modest? Or do you appear sloppy, trendy, or attention seeking? People should be able to tell you're a Christian by the way you talk. Are your words gracious, constructive, and tactful? Or are your words demeaning, crass, or profane? Finally, people should be able to tell you're a Christian by what you associate with. Are you known as a fan of, or do you promote celebrities, movies, or TV shows which proclaim messages that are opposed to the gospel? In summary, do you blend in with the unbelievers around you, or do you stand out? If you're going to be separate from the world, you have to live differently from the world, and they need to be able to see that difference. So thanks for watching. I hope you learned something here, and I hope you feel challenged to apply what you've learned to your life. And I hope you'll join me for part 2, in which we'll discuss the rest of this passage.